There is a place in the world where the desert meets the stars in almost perfect silence, where ancient cities rise from the dust as if they have always been there. And perhaps they have, because in this part of the world, history does not feel like something that happened long ago. It feels present. It feels like something you could reach out and touch. Tonight, we are going to that place together. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. Let your breathing slow. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. For the next few hours, you are simply going to listen. And little by little, as the words wash over you, you might find yourself drifting somewhere very far away, somewhere ancient, somewhere quietly extraordinary. We are going to Uzbekistan. You may have heard the name before, perhaps in passing, perhaps in a history lesson about the Silk Road, or perhaps it simply floated into your awareness the way certain names do, carrying a faint suggestion of somewhere distant and golden. Uzbekistan sits at the very heart of Central Asia, landlocked and ancient, surrounded by the countries that share its deep and complicated past. It is a place most people know very little about, and that is part of what makes it so beautiful to explore. There are no crowded assumptions here, just open history, open desert, open sky. This is a country that has been home to some of the greatest cities the ancient world ever produced: Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva. These are not just names, they are legends. For thousands of years, merchants carried silk and spices and stories through these cities, and those stories seeped into the walls, into the minarets, into the very dust beneath your feet. Empires rose and fell here. Conquerors arrived and eventually moved on. And through all of it, the people of this land continued, adapting, building, remembering. But we are not going to rush through any of that tonight. We are going to move slowly, the way time itself seems to move differently in a place this old. We will begin with land, the mountains and the rivers and the great open stretches of desert. And we will let the story grow from there, the way all stories grow from the ground up. We will meet the earliest people who called this place home, long before there were cities or kings or written records. We will watch gently as those small communities became something larger, as trade routes opened and empires formed, and the whole shimmering, complicated history of Central Asia began to take shape around this quiet central place. And along the way, we'll learn 100 things about Uzbekistan. 100 small windows into a world that is easy to overlook and impossible, once you have looked, to forget. So take a slow breath. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let the rest of the world fade back a little. We are beginning now. Chapter 1. Location and geography. To understand a place, you have to start with the land itself, not the history, not the people, not the empires that came and went, just the land, the shape of it, the weight of it, the way it sits in the world. And Uzbekistan sits in a very particular way. It rests at the heart of Central Asia, not near the edges, not brushing up against any ocean or sea, but deep inside the continent, tucked between mountain ranges and rivers and vast open desert. It lies almost entirely within the northern and eastern hemispheres, centered around roughly 41 degrees north latitude and 64 degrees east longitude. If you were to close your eyes and picture a map of the world, you would find it somewhere in that wide, quiet middle. The part of the map that most people's eyes tend to drift past on their way to somewhere more familiar. The country stretches roughly 1,400 kilometers from west to east, and about 930 kilometers from north to south. In total, it covers somewhere close to 448,000 square kilometers, a significant piece of the Earth, though its true scale is easy to underestimate until you are standing inside it. And here is one of its most quietly remarkable qualities. Uzbekistan is landlocked. Not just landlocked in the ordinary sense, bordered by countries that touch the sea somewhere in the distance, but doubly landlocked. Every single one of its neighbors is landlocked too. No matter which direction you travel from Uzbekistan, you will cross at least 2 international borders before you ever reach an ocean. There is only one other country on Earth that shares this distinction, and that is Liechtenstein, a tiny nation in the heart of Europe that could fit inside Uzbekistan thousands of times over. It is a strange and humbling kind of isolation. The sea is not just far away. It is, in a sense, structurally absent. To the north and northwest lies Kazakhstan, enormous and steppe-filled. To the northeast, the mountain country of Kyrgyzstan. Southeast brings you to Tajikistan, and further south to Afghanistan. To the southwest and west, Turkmenistan completes the circle. 5 neighbors, all of them inland, all of them sharing in that same deep continental quietness. The land within those borders is largely open and low. Around 80% of Uzbekistan's territory is made up of lowlands and desert, flat, ancient, and immense. Dominating the central and western stretches is the Kızılkum Desert, whose name means red sand in the Turkic languages of the region. It is one of the largest deserts in Central Asia, a rolling expanse of Saxaul trees and shifting dunes, and extraordinary silence. In the far northwest, the Ustyurt Plateau extends like a high, flat table above the surrounding lowlands, a remote and windswept place that has seen nomadic movement for thousands of years. But Uzbekistan is not only desert and plain. In the east, tucked between the shoulders of surrounding mountain ranges, lies the Fergana Valley, perhaps the most important piece of ground in the entire country. It is fertile and green, watered by rivers that come down from the mountains, and it has been home to dense human settlement for an extraordinarily long time. The valley is shared loosely with parts of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and its borders are complicated in the way that geography and politics so often are in this part of the world. But within Uzbekistan, it is the heartland, the place where the land breathes most easily. Further into the east and southeast, the terrain rises. Foothills give way to mountain ranges connected to the Great Tian Shan system, with peaks climbing to somewhere around 4,500 meters. It is a landscape that shifts dramatically over short distances, from the baked flatness of the desert to the cool, sharp air of the high ranges, all within the same country. Threading through all of this are 2 rivers whose names recur again and again through the history of Central Asia: the Amudarya and the Sirdarya, 2 great rivers flowing through and along the edges of Uzbekistan, forming the irrigation corridors that made settled life possible in an otherwise arid land. ancient civilizations grew up along their banks. Cities rose near their waters. For thousands of years, these rivers were not just geographical features. They were the reason people stayed. And both of them, historically, fed into the Aral Sea, a vast inland body of water in the northwest that was, for most of recorded history, one of the largest lakes on Earth. Ships crossed it, fish filled it, communities built their lives around its shores. But in the 20th century, Soviet-era irrigation projects diverted so much water from the Amudarya and Sirdarya that the Aral Sea began to shrink and shrink and shrink. Today, what was once open water is largely a dry, salt-crusted desert floor. The Aralkum, a new desert born in living memory. Rusting ships sit stranded in the sand, miles from where the waterline once was. It is one of the most striking environmental changes of the modern era, and it is visible from space. Uzbekistan's northwestern edge touches that former shoreline. The landscape there is haunted in a quiet way. Not dramatic, not ruined exactly, but changed in a way that is difficult to look at without feeling the slow weight of consequence. That is the land, flat and vast and ancient in the west, green and fertile in the east, mountainous in the southeast, and carrying in its northwest corner the ghost of a sea that used to be. This is where our story begins. Chapter 2: Early Human Presence. Before the cities, before the caravans and the trade routes and the great tiled domes catching the desert light, before any of that, they were just people, moving quietly through a landscape that looked, in many ways, much as it does today. The same mountains rising in the east, the same rivers finding their way across the same flat plains, the same stars overhead, and people have been here for a very, very long time. The territory of what is now Uzbekistan is considered one of the ancient centers of human presence on Earth. Not ancient in the way that a medieval city feels ancient, or even the way a Bronze Age settlement does, but ancient in deep geological time. Evidence suggests that human beings, or our earliest ancestors, were moving through this land somewhere in the order of 1 to 1.5 million years ago. That number is difficult to hold in the mind. 1 million years ago, the world was a different place in almost every measurable way. And yet, here, on this same ground, something recognizably human was already present. One of the most important windows into that deep past is a site called Kulbulak in Tashkent province. It is an open-air site, not a cave, and what makes it remarkable is what lies beneath the surface. The archaeological deposits at Kulbulak go down nearly 19 meters. 19 meters of accumulated human time, layer upon layer, each one telling a slightly different part of the story. Within those layers, researchers have found stone tools from across the entire span of the Paleolithic, the lower, the middle and the upper, giving Kulbulak the quality of a long, slow record of human presence in Central Asia. A library written in stone. But it is further south, in the Surkhandarya region, where one of the most quietly moving discoveries in this entire region was made. In a cave called Teshik Tash, in the mountains near the Afghan border, archaeologists found the burial of a child, a Neanderthal child, somewhere between 9 and 10 years old, laid to rest in the earth perhaps 60 or 70,000 years ago. The burial was associated with Mysterian stone tools. a distinctive toolkit that Neanderthals carried across much of the ancient world. And it placed these people definitively in Central Asia. But it was not just the burial itself that left such an impression on those who studied it. It was what surrounded the child. Arranged around the grave were the horns of wild goats, deliberately placed, carefully positioned. Whether this was ritual or ceremony, or something else entirely that we have no name for, researchers have long interpreted it as evidence of something profound, that the beings who buried this child were not simply disposing of the dead. They were doing something more. They were, in some sense, marking the moment, acknowledging it. That impulse to mark, to remember, to surround the gone with something meaningful is one of the oldest things we know about the people who lived here. To the north, near Tashkent, in the foothills of the western Tian Shan range, another cave carries its own chapter of the story. Obi Rakhmat Grotto is a shallow karst cave that has produced both Neanderthal remains and an exceptionally rich collection of stone tools. What makes Obi Rakhmat particularly interesting is the nature of those tools. The assemblage there shows features of both Middle Paleolithic and what researchers call the initial Upper Paleolithic. Two distinct technological traditions appearing together or in close sequence, suggesting that something was shifting, a transition of some kind, technological and perhaps demographic, playing out in these mountain caves around 80 to 70,000 years ago. And the tools themselves speak to something beyond simple survival. Among the lithic finds at Obi Rakhmat, careful analysis has identified what appear to be light projectile points, small work pieces interpreted as early arrow or spear heads. If this interpretation holds, it places advanced hunting technology in this region at around 80,000 years ago, earlier than many traditional models would expect. The mountains of Central Asia, it seems, were not a peripheral backwater of human development. They were somewhere that things were happening, and perhaps happening earlier than we once assumed. The high mountain zones of the Chatkal Range, further into the western Tian Shan, add another layer still. Survey work there has shown that Paleolithic people were not merely passing through the mountains on their way to somewhere else. They were using them, repeatedly, over tens of thousands of years, across the period roughly spanning 130 to 30,000 years ago. Temporary camps, tool scatter, the quiet evidence of people who knew these highlands well and returned to them again and again across seasons and generations. As time moved forward, slowly, as it always does in the deep human past, the nature of that presence began to change. Across the Surkhandarya region, around Tashkent, in the Samarkand area, and the Fergana Valley, archaeological finds begin to tell a slightly different story. Early ceramics appear. Tools become more refined. There are signs of fishing, of early cultivation, of crafts. The long, patient shift from purely foraging lifeways towards something more settled, more intentional, was beginning to take shape. It did not happen all at once. It never does. But the direction was becoming clear. And in the south, in a gorge called Zarautsai in the Surkhandarya region, among the stone walls of a narrow canyon, there are petroglyphs, ancient carvings of human figures pressed into the rock by hands we will never know. They are not detailed in the way that later art would become. They are simple, elemental, shapes that suggest a body, a form, a presence. But they are there. They were made deliberately by someone who chose to mark that particular rock face with something of themselves. It is one of the oldest forms of communication we know, the desire to leave a trace, to say, in whatever language was available, stone, pigment, arrangement of horn, I was here. This mattered. This was real. Long before Samarkand was built, long before the first caravans crossed the desert, long before any of the history we usually call history, this land was already full of people doing exactly that. Chapter 3: Early Societies and Daily Life. There's a particular kind of human patience that only becomes visible across thousands of years. The patience of people who, generation by generation, made small decisions to stay a little longer, to plant a little more, to build something that might last, without ever knowing that those decisions would accumulate into something we would one day call civilization. That patience is what this chapter is about. At a place called Kanakamar, a rock shelter in the western part of Central Asia, archaeologists have uncovered a sequence of human occupation that spans more than 10,000 years. 10,000 years of the same place being used, returned to, built upon. First by mobile hunter-gatherers moving with the seasons, and then, gradually, by people who were beginning to think about staying. The rock shelter itself is modest, but the depth of time preserved within it is extraordinary. It is one of the clearest records we have of the long, patient transition from a world of constant movement to a world of roots. By around the 6th millennium BCE, 6,000 years before the Common Era, a span of time that begins to defy easy imagination, communities in parts of what is now Uzbekistan were settling into something recognizably different from what had come before. Pottery was being made and used. Dwellings were becoming more permanent, built to last seasons rather than days. Animals were being herded rather than only hunted. Plants were being cultivated in small, tended plots rather than simply gathered where they grew. None of this happened overnight. None of it was decided. It was the slow accumulation of practical choices made in the quiet rhythms of daily life that over centuries added up to a new way of being in the world. Then came the Bronze Age, and with it something remarkable in the south. In the oases of southern Uzbekistan, a network of communities emerged that archaeologists now call the Bactria Magyana Archaeological Complex, the BMAC, sometimes also known as the Oxus civilization. It was not a single empire or a unified state. It was something more diffuse than that, and perhaps more interesting. A constellation of fortified towns, irrigated fields, and craft centers spread across the southern edge of Central Asia and connected by trade and cultural exchange to places as far away as Iran and the Indus Valley. These were not isolated communities scratching a living from difficult ground. They were part of a wider world, linked by commerce and movement and the slow migration of ideas. Two sites in particular bring this world into focus. Sapali Tepe and Jarakutan, both in the Surkhandarya region of southern Uzbekistan, were planned settlements, not villages that simply grew organically over time, but places that were laid out with intention. Mud brick houses arranged in organized blocks, granaries for storing surplus grain, central fortified areas walled and defensible, suggesting communities that were both prosperous enough to have things worth protecting and organized enough to protect them collectively. Looking at the excavated plans of these sites, there is something almost immediately recognizable. The logic of streets and quarters, of public space and private space, of a community that has decided to build something lasting. Daily life in these Bronze Age settlements was anchored in irrigated agriculture. The oasis fields around these towns grew cereals, wheat and barley most likely, watered by channels drawn from nearby rivers. Animals were kept and herded. Surplus was stored in those granaries, a buffer against the uncertainty of seasons and harvests. In the workshops and homes, craftspeople worked clay into pottery and metal into tools and ornaments. The rhythms of the day were shaped by fire and water and grain, by the slow, reliable work of people who had committed to a place and were building their lives around it. What the cemeteries of these communities reveal is perhaps even more vivid than the settlements themselves. At Jarkutan and the related Sapali culture burial sites, archaeologists have excavated more than 2,000 graves. Within them, thousands of ceramic vessels, carefully made, often beautifully formed, placed alongside the dead as offerings or provisions. Hundreds of metal objects, grave goods that vary significantly from burial to burial, suggesting a community that was not simply equal in all things. Some graves are richer than others. Some people, it seems, had more, whether through skill or birth, or the kind of accumulated advantage that appears wherever communities grow complex enough to allow it. Society, in other words, was already differentiating. The seeds of hierarchy, of specialization, of a world where not everyone did the same thing, were already present in these southern oases 4,000 years ago. Inside the houses themselves, daily life unfolded in spaces that feel, in their basic logic, quietly familiar. Multi-room mud brick homes organized into blocks and quarters, a cooking hearth at the center of domestic activity, warm in the evenings, smoky in the mornings, the gravitational heart of household life, storage rooms for food and tools, and the accumulated possessions of a family. Small courtyards open to the sky, where the practical work of daily living, grinding grain, repairing tools, tending children, would have taken place in the open air. These were not grand spaces. They were human-scaled and worn smooth by use, the kinds of places where ordinary life happened in ordinary ways. As time moved forward into the first millennium BCE and the early centuries of the Common Era, the regions that would become known as Sogdiana and Bactria settled into a mixed and layered social world. In the river oases, farmers tended their irrigated fields season after season. In the towns, craftsmen worked their trades and merchants organized the movement of goods along routes that were slowly becoming the arteries of a continent-wide trading system. And out in the surrounding steppe, mobile pastoralists moved their herds across seasonal pastures, tied to the settled world through exchange and occasional conflict, and the complex interdependence that always develops between people who need different things from the same landscape. Administrative documents surviving from the Achaemenid period, when the Persian Empire extended its reach into Bactria and Sogdiana, give rare, precise glimpses into this social world at the level of ordinary people. Soldiers listed by name, farmers noted in relation to the land they worked, local officials recording the labor and taxes owed by those in their jurisdiction. These are not grand historical narratives. They are administrative records, dry and functional. But in their dryness, they preserve something invaluable: the texture of everyday obligation, the sense of what it meant to be an ordinary person in this world, to owe service, to cultivate land, to guard a frontier, to be counted. And in the Kashkadaria oasis of southern Uzbekistan, recent archaeological work has identified a fortified city dating back around 2,300 years. A walled town already ancient by the time the Common Era began, sitting along roads that were becoming highways of trade and movement. For the people who lived within those walls, who woke in the morning and went about their work and came home at night to the same mud brick rooms and the same cooking fires, the city was simply life. Ordinary, familiar, unremarkable in the way that all daily life is unremarkable from the inside. But from where we stand now, looking back across those 2,000 years, it is anything but. Chapter 4: First Organized States. There comes a point in the life of any settled community where the village is no longer enough, where the walled town gives way to something larger, something with more structure to it. A king, a governor, a palace at the center of things, and a system of obligations radiating outward from it, like the channels of an irrigation network, where, in other words, a state begins. In the territory of what is now Uzbekistan, that moment came somewhere in the centuries before the Common Era, and it did not come in one place or one form, but in several, each shaped by its own geography, its own people, its own relationship with the land and the rivers and the trade routes beginning to thread across the continent. The first of these to take shape in the south was Bactria. Rising in the oases of what is now the Surkandarya region, Bactria was already a place of considerable sophistication by the 8th or 7th century BCE. Its craftspeople worked metal with exceptional skill. Its cities, among them the substantial site of Kiziltepe, were growing into genuine urban centers, complex enough to sustain populations, markets, and the kind of specialized labor that only becomes possible when enough surplus exists to free people from the fields. Bactria eventually came under the tributary reach of the Achaemenid Empire, the great Persian state that at its height stretched from Egypt to the edges of India. It paid its taxes and supplied its troops, as provinces of empires always do. But it retained its character, its craftsmen, its cities. Further north and west, in the delta of the Amudarya, near the place where Khiva would eventually stand, another state was forming. Khwarezm, also known as Khwarezmia, rose around the 6th century BCE as an irrigation-based kingdom in the flat, fertile land where the great river fractured into channels before losing itself in the desert. The people of Khwarezm built fortified citadels across this watered landscape, and they guarded their independence with some tenacity. While Bactria made its accommodations with Persian power, Khwarezm maintained a more resistant posture, a kingdom conscious of its own boundaries, its own water, its own way of doing things. And in the Zarafshan Valley, in the region around what would become Samarkand, a third distinct world was taking shape. Sogdiana. Of all the early states and regions of this land, Sogdiana would prove perhaps the most consequential in the long run, not through military power or imperial scale, but through something more durable and more quietly influential. The Sogdians were merchants, extraordinarily gifted, extraordinarily well-connected merchants who would eventually establish trading colonies across the length of the Silk Road from the Mediterranean to China. But in these early centuries, they were building the foundations of that world, a cluster of city-states in the fertile Zarafshan Valley, linked by commerce and the shared practice of Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith that saw the world as a contest between light and darkness, and that gave the Sogdians a framework of ethics and community that would hold their merchant networks together across vast distances. Then came the Achaemenids, the Persian Empire, at its expansionary height in the 6th through 4th centuries BCE, organized these varied regions into administrative units called satrapies. A satrapy was, in essence, a province governed by a satrap, a royally appointed official responsible for collecting taxes, raising troops when required, and maintaining order. It was a system elegant in its simplicity, practical in its reach. Local cultures and customs were, broadly, left alone. What the empire wanted was revenue and soldiers, and the satrapal system delivered both without requiring the kind of cultural erasure that later empires sometimes attempted. The cities of Bactria and Sogdiana continued their lives largely as before. They simply now paid their obligations to Persepolis rather than to local kings alone. That Persian order ended abruptly with Alexander. In the years between 329 and 327 BCE, Alexander the Great moved his armies through Bactria and Sogdiana in a campaign that was, by any measure, extraordinarily difficult. The terrain resisted him. The local leaders resisted him. Most famously, the Bactrian nobleman Spitamenes, who led a guerrilla resistance that tied down Macedonian forces for years and who remains, to this day, a figure of considerable national pride in Uzbekistan. Alexander eventually prevailed, as he generally did, but the conquest cost him more here than almost anywhere else. He founded cities, the Hellenistic habit, and he left garrisons and Greek settlers and the complex cultural residue that follows in the wake of conquest. He also married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, which was either a political calculation or something more personal, or perhaps both. The Greek cultural influence that Alexander planted took root in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom that formed after his death and the fracturing of his empire. Centered in the south, the Greco-Bactrian state lasted roughly from around 250 to 125 BCE, and it produced something genuinely unusual, a civilization that was neither purely Greek nor purely Central Asian, but a distinctive blend of both. Cities were built on Hellenistic principles, with colonnaded streets and public spaces familiar from the Mediterranean world. Coins were struck bearing the faces of Greek-style kings, but with inscriptions in both Greek and the local languages. At the site of Aykanum, just across the modern border in Afghanistan, but deeply connected to the southern Uzbek world, archaeologists uncovered a city that was, in its layout, recognizably Greek. A gymnasium, a theatre, administrative buildings arranged around a formal plan, standing improbably in the heart of Central Asia, its columns catching the same light as temples half a world away. That Greco-Bactrian world was eventually swept away by new arrivals from the steppe. Among them were the Yuezhi, nomadic people from the east who settled, consolidated, and eventually built something that would prove more lasting than what they had replaced. The Kushan Empire, which reached its height in the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, unified Bactria and Sogdiana under a single imperial structure and proved to be one of the great crossroads civilizations of the ancient world. The Kushans were enthusiastic sponsors of Buddhism, and under their patronage, the faith spread northward and eastward along the very trade routes their empire protected. Monasteries and stupas rose across the southern landscape. Silk Road commerce flourished. The empire sat at the meeting point of the Roman world, the Parthian world, the Indian world, and the Chinese world, and it grew rich and cosmopolitan on the traffic moving between them. Managing all of this, the irrigation canals that fed the oasis agriculture, the caravan routes that needed protecting, the nomadic groups pressing always at the edges, required governance of real sophistication. Satrapies, kings, local officials, garrison commanders. The great cities of the region, among them early Samarkand, known to archaeologists by the name of its ancient mound, Afrasiab, were already complex urban organisms. Citadels on high ground, palaces for the powerful, craft districts where gold and bronze and fine ceramics were produced for elite consumption and long-distance trade. Markets where things arrived from improbably far away. And it was that long-distance trade that underpinned everything. The elites of these early states grew wealthy on commerce, exporting the things this land produced and the things that passed through it. Horses prized across the ancient world for their quality. Lapis lazuli, that intense deep blue stone mined in the mountains of Afghanistan and traded westward into Egypt and Mesopotamia for millennia. Textiles of various kinds, and arriving in return, silk from China, moving westward along routes that would eventually bear its name. Spices from India, glass from the Mediterranean, ideas from everywhere. The land at the heart of the continent was not peripheral to the ancient world. It was, in many ways, the place where the ancient world's most important conversations happened. Chapter 5. Gradual changes over time. History rarely announces itself. Empires do not arrive with a single thunderclap, and civilizations do not fall in a single afternoon. What actually happens, what the long view reveals when you step back far enough to see it, is something more like a river, a constant movement, always in one direction, but full of eddies and diversions and slow bends that take centuries to complete. The land of Uzbekistan has been inside that river for a very long time, and this chapter is about watching it flow. We left the Bronze Age world of the southern oases, the mud brick towns, the granaries, the craftsmen working metal in the workshops of Sapali Tepe and Jakutan. That world did not simply end, it transformed. Somewhere around 2300 to 1000 BCE, the communities of the Bactria-Margiana complex were already feeling the first pressures of change. Shifts in climate, shifts in population, the slow exhaustion of some settlements and the growth of others. Irrigation systems were extended. The logic of organized oasis life was becoming more sophisticated. And in some places, the earliest signs of proto-writing were appearing. marks on clay and stone that suggest people were beginning to feel the need to record things, to keep track, to externalize memory onto a surface that would outlast the person who made it. Then, in the centuries around the 8 to 6 BCE, came the nomads, not as conquerors exactly, but as settlers. Iranian-speaking peoples from the steppe who moved into the landscape and over generations became part of it. The Scythians and their related groups brought with them the culture of the horse, horse-based warfare, horse-based mobility, a relationship with the animal that was as much spiritual as practical. And as they settled and founded the early kingdoms of Bactria, Sogdiana, and Khwarezm, they brought that energy into the walled cities and the irrigated fields and the emerging trade routes. The early Silk Road did not yet have a name, but its arteries were beginning to pulse. The Achaemenid centuries brought a different kind of change, not disruption so much as integration. When the Persian Empire extended its administrative reach into these regions in the 6th through 4th centuries BCE, it brought with it something that empires at their best can provide: standardization, a common coinage, a system of administration that connected local elites to a vast imperial network stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. Zoroastrianism, already present in various forms across Central Asia, became more formally embedded through Persian influence. Its temples tended, its rituals organized, its cosmology of light against darkness woven more deeply into the fabric of daily and civic life. Alexander came through like weather, sudden, violent, transformative, and then gone, leaving behind a changed landscape. In the Hellenistic era that followed his conquest, the cities of the region absorbed Greek ideas with a kind of selective enthusiasm. Urban planning took on Hellenistic forms: the grid, the colonnaded street, the theatre. Greek artistic conventions appeared in local metalwork and sculpture, softened and blended with Iranian aesthetics, until something new emerged that was neither one nor the other. At Afrasiab, the ancient mound beneath which early Samarkand lies, this blending was already visible in the layers of occupation, each one slightly different from the one below. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom that crystallized out of the post-Alexandrian world in the mid-3rd century BCE lasted roughly a century, and in that time it produced something culturally remarkable. Greek-speaking rulers who issued coins bearing their portraits in the classical tradition, but who governed populations steeped in Iranian and Central Asian culture, and who patronized the expanding practice of Buddhism alongside older traditions. Philosophy and commerce and devotion coexisted in the cities of the south. Lapis lazuli still moving westward through markets that were growing ever more connected. The Kushans, arriving from the steppe in the first centuries of the Common Era, gave the region its next great synthesis. These were nomads who had become something else, builders of a genuine imperial state that stretched across an enormous swathe of Central Asia and South Asia. Under Kushan patronage, Buddhism reached a kind of golden moment in this part of the world. Monumental temples were raised. Silk Road commerce was actively encouraged and protected. The empire became a meeting point of 4 of the ancient world's great civilizations simultaneously. And in that meeting, something syncretic and cosmopolitan and genuinely alive emerged. Kushan art, Kushan philosophy, Kushan coinage. all of it reflecting a world that absorbed more influences than it could fully separate. The Sassanid and Hephthalite periods that followed were less a single transformation than a long, complicated weathering. Iranian Sassanid power pressed in from the west and south. The Hepthalites, the so-called White Huns, moved through from the steppe. Cavalry tactics were refined by people who had been thinking about horses and warfare for centuries. Zoroastrianism continued its life in the oasis towns and the merchant communities, sustained by a priestly class who maintained its rituals even as political power shifted above them. The oasis economies held. The trade continued. The cities endured, patched and rebuilt and adjusted as they always had been. Then came the Arabs. In the late 7th and early 8th centuries CE, the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate moved through Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River, in a series of campaigns that were militarily successful but culturally complex. The Turkic Khaganate, which had dominated the steppes and exerted significant influence over the region, gave way before this advance. And with the Arab presence came things that would prove far more durable than any political arrangement. The Arabic script, mosques rising alongside fire temples, and the long, slow process of conversion from Zoroastrianism to Islam. It was not immediate, and it was not uniform. In the villages and the oasis towns, old practices lingered beneath new vocabularies. But the direction of change was set. The Samanid dynasty, which rose to prominence in Bukhara and Samarkand in the 9th and 10th centuries CE, represents one of the most luminous chapters in this entire long story. Persian-speaking and Islamic, the Samanids presided over what is sometimes called a renaissance, a flowering of intellectual and artistic life that made the cities of Transoxiana into genuine centers of world civilization. Scholars of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy worked in the courts and libraries of Bukhara. Poets wrote in a refined Persian that became the literary language of half the Islamic world. The scholar Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was born near Bukhara under Samanid rule, and his medical and philosophical writings would shape European thought for centuries. This was not a provincial backwater absorbing the culture of others. This was a place generating ideas that the rest of the world would spend generations catching up with. And then, in the 14th and 15th centuries, came Timur. Timur, Tamerlane to European chroniclers, was a conqueror of extraordinary brutality and extraordinary aesthetic ambition, a combination that produces a particular kind of legacy. He was born near Samarkand, and he made Samarkand his capital, and what he built there, what he commanded to be built, dragging craftsmen from the ruins of the cities he had sacked across the Islamic world, was something that took the breath away. Grand mosques with tilework of intense blue and turquoise, madrasas where scholars gathered, an observatory where his grandson Ulugh would eventually map the stars with a precision that would not be surpassed in Europe for another century. Persian aesthetics and Turkic power and Islamic devotion fused into an architectural tradition that still defines what people picture when they close their eyes and think of Samarkand. The changes had not been gradual in the way that word usually implies. They had been punctuated and sometimes violent, but the accumulation, across 3,000 years of transition, had produced something extraordinary. A place layered with every civilization that had ever passed through it, each one leaving something behind. Chapter 6: Outside Influence or Foreign Rule. There is something about the geography of Central Asia that has always drawn the attention of the powerful. It sits at the center of things, at the crossing point of north and south, east and west. And that position, so valuable for trade and communication, has also made it, across the centuries, an almost irresistible object of ambition. Empires have looked at this land and seen what it could offer them. And so, again and again, across a span of history that covers more than 2,500 years, outside forces have arrived, imposed their will, and left their mark. This is the story of those arrivals. The first to organize their presence formally were the Achaemenid Persians in the 6th through 4th centuries BCE. We have already met them briefly: the satraps, the tribute systems, the administrative logic of a vast empire managing its distant provinces. But it is worth pausing on what Persian rule actually meant at the level of lived experience. For the cities of Bactria, Sogdiana, and Khwarezm, Achaemenid authority brought with it a cultural gravity. Zoroastrianism, already rooted in the region, was reinforced and formalized through the empire's patronage of its religious structures. The old Persian language and script circulated through administrative documents. Local elites who cooperated with the satrapal system gained access to imperial networks of wealth and influence, a bargain that many found worth making, even if it meant acknowledging a king in Persepolis as the ultimate authority over their affairs. Then came Alexander, and with him the Seleucids who followed in the fractured aftermath of his conquests. The Greek presence brought something different, not just administrative overlay, but an attempt to physically reshape the urban landscape. Military colonies were planted, populated with Macedonian veterans and Greek settlers. Cities were founded or refounded on Hellenistic principles. Coinage bearing Greek portraits and Greek inscriptions began to circulate in markets that had previously used Persian-style currency. The effect was not erasure of what had existed before. The Iranian and Central Asian cultures in the region were too deep-rooted for that. But it was a genuine transformation of surface and form. The cities began to look different. The art began to look different. And the conversations happening in those cities began to include new voices, new references, new ways of thinking about the world. The Kushans, who we have also encountered, represent a different kind of outside influence, the influence of the steppe made sedentary. The Yuezhi people had come from somewhere to the east, displaced by other movements of the nomadic world, and had settled in Bactria with a practical flexibility that eventually became imperial ambition. Their rule introduced Buddhism to the region with real institutional weight. Monasteries, shrines, a visual culture of devotion that left physical traces across the southern landscape. And through their empire, the Silk Road achieved a new level of connectivity, binding the markets and ideas of Rome, Parthia, India, and China into a single, humming system of exchange. The Sassanid Persians, who rose to power in the 3rd century CE and whose influence in Central Asia persisted into the 7th, brought the region back into the Persian cultural orbit after the Kushan centuries. Zoroastrian fire temples were maintained and promoted. The Sassanid military tradition, heavy cavalry, armored horsemen, sophisticated siege techniques, shaped the way the Oasis kingdoms organized their own defenses against the nomadic groups that pressed constantly at their edges. Sassanid influence in the region was not always direct political control. It was often more diffuse than that, a cultural and religious gravity that pulled the Oasis cities toward Iranian ways of doing things even when Persian armies were not physically present. The Arab conquest of the 7th and early 8th centuries was a rupture of a different order. The armies of the early Islamic Caliphate arrived in Transoxiana with a missionary as well as a military purpose. Samarkand fell. Bukhara fell. The fire temples that had stood for centuries were converted or replaced. Arabic script began to appear on buildings and in documents alongside the Iranian scripts that had come before. The process of Islamicization was gradual. It took generations for the new faith to become genuinely embedded in the daily life of ordinary people. But it was also, ultimately, profound and lasting. The Islam that took root in the cities of Central Asia was not a simple transplant from the Arabian heartland. It absorbed local traditions, adapted to local conditions, and eventually produced its own distinctive intellectual and spiritual culture. But its arrival was nonetheless one of the most consequential outside influences this land has ever experienced. The Turkic dynasties that followed, the Karakhanids in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Seljuks extending their reach through the 11th and 12th, represented a blending of two worlds. These were rulers who had emerged from the nomadic steppe tradition, but who had thoroughly absorbed Persian administrative culture and Sunni Islamic piety. The courts of the Karakhanids and Seljuks were Persian in their language of governance, Islamic in their religious architecture and patronage, and Turkic in their military organization and political instincts. It was a synthesis that would prove enduring. The particular combination of Persian cultural sophistication and Turkic political energy that would define the region's high culture for centuries to come. Then the Mongols arrived. In the 13th century, the armies of the Mongol Empire and subsequently the Ilkhanate under Hulagu moved through Central Asia with a destructive force that is almost impossible to convey through the language of historical summary. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years and accumulated the libraries and scholarship and mercantile wealth of generations were sacked with systematic thoroughness. Samarkand was devastated. Bukhara was burned. The irrigation infrastructure that had sustained oasis agriculture for millennia was damaged in ways that took decades to repair. The human cost was staggering. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most catastrophic events in the history of this part of the world. And yet, history being what it is, the Mongol period also eventually brought a degree of stabilization. As the initial violence subsided and Mongol successor states established themselves, the trade routes recovered. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace across the vast Mongol-controlled territories, allowed commerce to move again, and the cities of Central Asia, battered but not extinguished, began the long work of rebuilding. The Timurid Empire, which we have already encountered in the previous chapter, belongs here too, because Timur was himself a product of the Turco-Mongol world. His authority derived from a lineage that combined Turkic military tradition with Mongol political legitimacy. His conquests were brutal in the Mongol fashion, but his cultural patronage, the mosques, the madrasas, the observatory at Samarkand, the bringing of craftsmen from across the Islamic world to embellish his capital, represented an outside influence that enriched rather than depleted. The Russian Empire arrived in the 1860s. It was a different kind of conquest, industrial age imperialism, rather than the step-born ambitions of earlier centuries. The Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand, which had been the successors to earlier Uzbek power in the region, were absorbed as protectorates or directly annexed. What the Russians wanted primarily was cotton. The fertile oasis lands were converted to cotton monoculture on a massive scale, feeding the textile mills of the industrializing Russian economy. Railroads were built, the first the region had ever seen, connecting the cotton fields to Russian markets. Russian administrators arrived. Russian settlers followed. The Khanates retained nominal authority in some cases, but real power had moved decisively to St. Petersburg and then Moscow. And then, after the revolution, came the Soviet Union. In 1924, Soviet authorities delimited the borders of a new entity, the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. The boundaries drawn then, across ethnic and geographic complexity that resisted clean lines, are essentially the borders of the country today. What followed over the next 6.5 decades was an experience of outside influence more total and more systematic than anything that had come before. Collectivization of agriculture. The cotton monoculture intensified rather than relaxed. The Aral Sea was sacrificed in large part to irrigate it. The suppression of Islam, which had been the spiritual and cultural heartbeat of the region for over 1,000 years. Russification, the promotion of the Russian language in schools and administration. The rewriting of history to fit Soviet narratives. And yet, as with every other outside influence this land has absorbed across 2,500 years, the people endured, practiced their faith quietly, kept their language, maintained the threads of a culture that was older, and it would turn out more durable than the ideology that had tried to contain it. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and Uzbekistan, carrying all of those layers, Persian, Greek, Kushan, Arab, Mongol, Timurid, Russian, Soviet, emerged as an independent country for the first time in its modern history. Chapter 7. Ordinary life under these changes. Empires write the headlines, but ordinary people write the days. For all the conquests and satrapies and khans and caliphs that have moved through this land across 2,500 years, the deeper story, the quieter one, the one that continued regardless of who was issuing the decrees from the capital, was always the story of daily life. The farmer checking the irrigation channel at dawn, the woman grinding grain in the courtyard, the trader weighing silk in the bazaar, the child learning prayers in a language that hadn't existed in this valley a generation ago. These are the people who actually lived inside history, rather than making it, and their lives are worth pausing on. In the Achaemenid centuries, the Persian administrative machine required tribute, grain, horses, labor. The farmers and herders of the oasis communities paid what was asked of them and went back to their fields. The irrigation channels still needed tending. They always needed tending. And the rhythms of the agricultural year were more powerful than any imperial decree. What did change, slowly and in ways that were felt more in the texture of daily life than in its structure, was religious atmosphere. Zoroastrian fire rituals moved from the cities into the villages, blending with older practices of ancestor worship that had been in this land for far longer than any empire. The hearth fire took on new meaning, or perhaps just new vocabulary. It had always been the center of the home, and now it was also, in some sense, the center of the cosmos. The Hellenistic period brought visible changes to the cities, but for most people, life continued in its familiar patterns. In the towns, those who were curious or commercially inclined found new venues. Greek-style theatres repurposed as gathering spaces, gymnasiums serving as markets and meeting points. The Hellenistic urban form adapted to Central Asian habits with a practical ease that said something about how cultures actually blend in practice. But out in the countryside, and in the caravanserais along the growing trade routes, the daily world changed very little. Goats were herded, barley was threshed, goods were exchanged at stops that had been stopping places for generations, now simply doing the same work within a different political frame. In the Kushan centuries, the Silk Road was no longer an emerging phenomenon, but an established fact of life, and its effects reached into ordinary households in tangible ways. Families in the towns of Bactria grew wheat and cotton in their oasis fields, as they always had, but the merchants who passed through brought things from improbably far away. Indian spices that found their way into the cooking pot, new flavors absorbed into a cuisine that was already a palimpsest of influences. Artisans in the workshops of the cities were busy making Buddhist statues for the temples that the Kushan rulers were funding across the landscape. A new kind of commission, a new iconography to learn, but the same basic work of skilled hands responding to the demands of whoever held power and had things to spend. Under the Sassanids, community life organized itself in ways that were both practical and devotional in the same gesture. Zoroastrian priests oversaw the festivals that marked the agricultural calendar, the new year, the harvest, the turning of seasons, weaving religious meaning into the rhythms that the land itself imposed. Canals were repaired collectively as they had always been, because a canal that silted up or broke its banks was everyone's problem regardless of theology or politics. Villages maintained their own local militias against the nomadic raids that were a periodic reality of life on the edge of the steppe. And in the evenings, in the cool air after the day's work, people brewed beer from the barley that the fields produced and sat together in the way that people in small communities have always sat together. The Arab conquest and the coming of Islam changed the texture of daily life more profoundly than almost any other transition, but more slowly than the history books sometimes suggest. In the towns, mosques appeared. The call to prayer became the new organizer of the day's hours, 5 times marking the passage of a time in a voice that carried across rooftops and market squares. Men learned Arabic for prayer, a language none of them had spoken a generation before, absorbing its rhythms and its phrases without necessarily understanding all of what they meant. But out in the fields and the smaller settlements, the transformation was measured in generations rather than years. Melons were still grown in the same plots they had always occupied. Sheep were still raised in the same way. The faith arrived like a tide, slowly, then all at once in some places, and barely at all in others for a long time. The Turkic Karakanid and Seljuk centuries brought a different kind of everyday change. The intimate, domestic kind that comes from intermarriage and cultural mixing at the household level, rather than from above. Nomadic Turkic peoples settled into the towns and suburbs, and with them came their habits. The felt tent, practical and portable, appeared alongside mud brick houses in the outskirts of cities. Food customs shifted in subtle ways. Certain meats approached differently. Certain preparations absorbed from steppe tradition into the urban kitchen. In the bazaars, which were the true heartbeat of any Central Asian city, traders haggled over Chinese silks and local textiles and the accumulated produce of an interconnected world, the same as they had done for centuries, in a language that was slowly blending Turkic and Persian into something new. After the Mongol devastation of the 13th century, the task of ordinary life became simply rebuilding. The qanats, the underground channels that brought water from the mountains to the oasis fields, had been damaged or destroyed in the violence. Families who had lost everything set about the long work of recovery with the quiet determination that survival demands. Women wove rugs, some as expressions of cultural identity, some as the tax payments that the new Ilkhanid overlords required in goods rather than coin. Fields were ploughed again. The grief was real and deep and did not go away quickly, but alongside it, unhurriedly, life reconstituted itself. In the Timurid centuries, ordinary life unfolded in the shadow of extraordinary beauty. Urban craftspeople embroidered the banners and decorated the garments that Timur's court required, their skilled hands producing the visual language of an imperial aesthetic that was, by any standard, magnificent. In the countryside and smaller towns, the culture of the tea house and the communal meal, the great levelling institution of Central Asian social life, continued as it always had. Scholars and poets were genuinely celebrated in this world, not as remote figures, but as presences in daily life. A rural household hosting a passing scholar for the night might spend the evening listening to poetry recited by firelight, the grain ground earlier in the day now becoming the pilaf shared around a communal cloth spread on the floor. Learning and pleasure and sustenance, all in the same gesture. The Russian imperial period introduced the most disruptive material change that ordinary rural life had yet experienced. Cotton quotas. The fertile fields that had grown wheat and melons and vegetables for local consumption were increasingly given over to cotton, not by choice, but by the economic logic of imperial agriculture, enforced by the distant demands of Russian textile mills. Peasant farmers became in effect cotton producers serving a market they would never see. The railroads that the Russians built changed the pace and texture of movement through the landscape. Journeys that had taken weeks now took days. But the Chorsu bazaars of the cities, those ancient circular markets where goods had been exchanged for centuries, continued their business with a continuity that was almost defiant. And then the Soviet era arrived, with its collectivized farms and its mechanized harvests and its systematic attempt to reshape daily life according to an ideology that had been conceived very far from these oasis towns. Women gained access to literacy and factory work in ways that genuinely expanded the possibilities of their lives. That is worth saying plainly because it was real. But the form that daily life was permitted to take was narrower in other ways. The tea house culture persisted quietly as a space of community that the state found difficult to fully control. Extended family structures held. The smell of plov cooking, that slow braised rice and meat dish that is, in some sense, the most fundamental expression of Uzbek domestic culture, rose from the same courtyards it always had, in defiance of collective dining halls and official schedules. Across all those centuries and all those rulers, one thing remained constant. People woke in the morning. They worked, they fed their families, they sat together in the evenings, they maintained the things that mattered to them: the water, the fields, the faith, the food, the conversation, with a quiet persistence that no empire, however powerful, ever quite managed to interrupt for long. Chapter 8: Transition to the Modern Era. Independence, when it finally came, arrived almost by accident. For most of its Soviet decades, Uzbekistan had not been a country that loudly demanded its own nationhood. There had been no sustained independence movement of the kind that had been building in the Baltic states, no prolonged public agitation for separation from Moscow. The apparatus of Soviet governance had been deeply embedded here, in the economy, in the institutions, in the careers of the people who ran things. And then, in August 1991, a group of hardliners in Moscow attempted a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. It failed within days, and in the vacuum that followed, as the authority of the Soviet center suddenly evaporated, the republics that had been bound to it began, one after another, to step away. On August 31st, 1991, Uzbekistan declared independence. The Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic became simply the Republic of Uzbekistan, a name change that carried the weight of centuries. A referendum followed on December 29th of the same year. The result was overwhelming: 98.2% in favor of independence. In the same vote, Islam Karimov, who had been the first secretary of the Uzbek Communist Party, was confirmed as the country's first president. It was a transition that was, in its mechanics, remarkably smooth, because the people who had been running Uzbekistan under the Soviet system were largely the same people who would run it now. The People's Democratic Party, which Karimov's apparatus formed from the remnants of the Communist Party, provided the institutional continuity that kept the machinery of the state functioning through the uncertainty of those first months. There was a practical logic to all of this, even if it sat uncomfortably alongside the idealism that the word independence tends to carry. A newly sovereign country needed functioning institutions immediately: a military, a security service, a currency, a diplomatic identity. In September 1991, a Ministry of Defense and a National Security Service were established. The infrastructure of statehood was being assembled in real time, improvised from the Soviet structures that had existed the week before under different names and different allegiances. For a while, the legal framework of the country remained the 1978 Soviet Constitution. there simply wasn't time to produce something new from scratch. When a new constitution was eventually adopted in 1992, it emphasized sovereignty and national identity, but retained the centralized structure of governance that the Soviet system had made habitual. Power remained concentrated. The institutions of accountability that might have balanced it were slow to develop. On December 21st, 1991, Uzbekistan joined the Commonwealth of Independent States, the loose successor framework that Russia and most of the former Soviet republics created to manage their newly complicated relationships with one another. It was a careful, pragmatic choice. The economic ties between Uzbekistan and Russia were too deep and too practical to simply sever. The pipelines, the supply chains, the trade relationships, all of it needed to be unwound gradually rather than cut at once. Joining the CIIHAS allowed Uzbekistan to maintain those connections while asserting its own sovereign identity, a balance that would define its foreign policy posture for years to come. Economically, the early years of independence were difficult in the way that transitions always are. Small enterprises were privatized. The bazaars and the workshops and the small service businesses that had operated in the grey zones of the Soviet economy now had a more formal status. But the deeper structure of the Uzbek economy, built around cotton, organized around Soviet-era collective farms, dependent on irrigation systems that were already destroying the Aral Sea, did not change quickly. Cotton monoculture persisted because it was what the land had been organized to produce and what the existing infrastructure was built to support. The environmental damage that Soviet policies had set in motion continued to accumulate. Politically, the Karimov years, which would last until his death in 2016, were defined by a particular kind of stability. It was stability that came at a cost. The Berlik movement, one of the most significant opposition voices of the early independence period, was suppressed. Other political challengers found themselves marginalized, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Karimov's government justified this in the language of security. The region was genuinely unstable. The civil war in Tajikistan was a visible reminder of what state collapse looked like, and the rise of Islamist militancy in Afghanistan and along Uzbekistan's borders was a real rather than invented concern. The argument for order over openness found many takers in those uncertain years. Whether it was the right balance is a question that Uzbekistani society is still, in some ways, working through. But underneath the political constraints, ordinary national life was being built. September 1st became Independence Day, a date that filled Tashkent and the other cities with parades and fireworks and concerts, with the particular energy of a people expressing for the first time in living memory an uncomplicated public pride in the country they lived in. The flag, the anthem, the public ceremonies of nationhood. These things matter to people, not because they are abstract symbols, but because they represent something real about identity and belonging and the right to name yourself. By the 2000s, gradual economic adjustments were underway. Currency convertibility was introduced in 2003, a significant practical step for a country that wanted to participate in international trade. Observer status at the World Trade Organization was secured. These were modest steps, and full economic liberalization remained a distant prospect while Karimov lived. But the direction was present, even if the pace was slow. When Karimov died in September 2016, the transition of power to Shavkat Mirziyoyev was managed without the instability that outsiders had sometimes predicted. And Mirziyoyev, to the surprise of many observers, began a program of reform that went further and faster than Karimov's government had ever permitted. Restrictions on currency exchange were eased. Some political prisoners were released. Relations with neighboring countries, particularly Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, with whom tensions had been high for years, began to warm. Tourism was actively encouraged, and the ancient cities that had been difficult to visit under the old system were opened more fully to the world. Uzbekistan's modern era was not the clean break that the word independence might imply. It was a negotiation between the Soviet inheritance and the national aspiration, between the need for stability and the desire for openness, between the weight of history and the demands of the present. That negotiation is still ongoing. It may always be ongoing, as it is in every country that takes its past seriously. But the country that emerged from it, ancient and young at the same time, carrying all those layers of civilization into a future it is still defining, is one of the most genuinely fascinating places on Earth. Chapter 9. The things the country is known for today. When people in other parts of the world think of Uzbekistan, when they have thought of it at all, certain images tend to surface. A blue dome catching desert light, a minaret rising from a flat cityscape, the words Silk Road, spoken with a faint reverence, as if the name itself still carries the weight of everything that once moved along it. Those images are not wrong, but they are only the beginning. The Silk Road is perhaps the single concept most inseparably associated with Uzbekistan in the popular imagination, and rightly so. For roughly 1,000 years, the cities of this land sat at the crossroads of the ancient world's most important trading network. The web of routes that connected China in the east to Persia and Rome in the west, and India to the south, and the steppe world to the north. Through Samarkand and Bukhara, through the caravansaries and the bazaars, moved silk and spices and glass and lapis lazuli and horses and perhaps most lastingly, ideas. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism. All of them traveled these roads. Mathematical knowledge, astronomical techniques, literary forms, all of them crossed this land. The Silk Road was not simply a trade route. It was the nervous system of the ancient world, and Uzbekistan was its beating heart. Then there is Timur, Tamerlane, as he is sometimes known outside the region, the conqueror who was born near Samarkand in 1336, and who, over the course of his extraordinary life, built an empire that stretched from Turkey to India. He was, by any honest accounting, a man of profound contradictions. His campaigns were marked by violence on a scale that shocked even his own era, and yet the city he loved, the city he kept returning to, the city he adorned with the proceeds of his conquests, Samarkand, became one of the most beautiful places the medieval world had ever produced. Timur understood that power needed beauty to be remembered, and he was right. His name endures not only because of what he destroyed, but because of what he built. The intellectual legacy that preceded and followed his era is equally remarkable. Under the Samanids, and then again under the Timurids, Bukhara and Samarkand became genuine centers of world scholarship. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose medical and philosophical encyclopedias shaped European thinking for centuries, was born and educated in the Bukhara of the Samanid period. Ulugh Timur's grandson, built an observatory in Samarkand in the 15th century and produced a star catalogue of extraordinary precision, a work of astronomical observation that was not surpassed in Europe until Tycho Brahe, a century and a half later. The Islamic intellectual tradition, at its height, was doing things in these cities that the rest of the world was not yet equipped to do. That history of scholarship and rigor is part of what Uzbekistan is known for, and part of what its people are quietly proud of. But it is perhaps the architecture that holds the deepest grip on those who encounter it. Registan Square in Samarkand. If there is a single image that defines this country for the outside world, it may be this one. 3 madrasas facing each other across a broad public space, their facades covered in geometric tilework in shades of blue and turquoise and gold that seem, in certain lights, to glow from within. The Ulugh Madrasa, the Sherdor, the Tilakari, each built in a different era, each slightly different in style, and together forming an ensemble of such coherence and grandeur that standing in the square, even in photographs, produces a kind of involuntary stillness. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is also simply one of the most beautiful things human beings have ever made. Near Registan, the Bibi Khanim Mosque stands as a monument to Timurid ambition at its most extraordinary scale. Timur commissioned it at the end of the 14th century, after his campaigns in India, and he intended it to be the largest mosque in the Islamic world. For a time, it may have been. Its great dome, its vast courtyard, its towering portal, all of it an expression of a power that needed to be seen as well as felt. The mosque has endured centuries of earthquake and weathering and Soviet-era reconstruction, and it remains, in its restored form, a presence of genuine monumentality. In Bukhara, the Poi Kalian complex holds a different kind of grandeur, older, perhaps more severe, and carrying one of the most remarkable survival stories in the architecture of the region. The Kalian minaret, rising nearly 50 meters from the flat cityscape of Bukhara, was built in the 12th century. When Genghis Khan arrived in Bukhara in 1220 and reduced much of the city to rubble, the minaret was, according to legend, the one thing that stopped him. He tilted his head back to look up at its height, and his hat fell from his head, and the gesture of bending to retrieve it was interpreted as a bow. The only bow, it was said, that Genghis Khan ever made. Whether the story is true is less important than what it says about how people have felt about this structure. It survived. In a landscape where so much was destroyed, the Kalian minaret stood, and it is still standing. Khiva, the westernmost of the great Uzbek historic cities, offers yet another kind of experience. The Ichankala, the walled inner city, is perhaps the most completely preserved of all the ancient urban environments in Central Asia. Walking inside its walls is genuinely like entering a different era. Minarets and mosques and palaces and caravanseries, all compressed into a tight medieval urban fabric, all built in the pale mud brick that takes on extraordinary warmth in the light of late afternoon. It is an open-air museum in the truest sense. Not a reconstruction, but the actual thing, preserved by the particular combination of dry climate and relative isolation that kept it from being consumed by the changes of the modern world. Back in Samarkand, Shah-i-Zinda is perhaps the most spiritually charged of all the great sites. A necropolis, a city of the dead, stretching along a narrow lane flanked by mausoleums, whose tilework spans nearly 800 years of craftsmanship. It is a pilgrimage site, and the presence of genuine devotion gives it an atmosphere unlike the more formally touristic monuments. People come here to pray as well as to look. The tilework on some of the mausoleums is among the finest in the Islamic world. Intricate, precise, brilliantly colored in ways that have barely faded despite the centuries. And at the end of that spiritual geography stands the Gur-e-Amir, the tomb of the king, Timur's mausoleum in Samarkand, with its famous ribbed turquoise dome rising above a drum decorated with calligraphy in gold and blue. It is the building that, more than almost any other in the region, sent an idea outward into the wider world. The architects who worked on the Gur-e-Amir influenced the tradition that would eventually produce the Humayun's tomb in Delhi, and through that, the Taj Mahal. The line of aesthetic descent runs from this modest-seeming city in Central Asia to one of the most famous buildings on Earth. That connection, once you know it, is difficult to unknow. And then, set against all of this beauty in history, there is cotton. White gold, as it was called, the crop that Soviet planners decided this land would produce above all else. And that has shaped the modern economy and the modern environment in ways both powerful and painful. Uzbekistan remains one of the world's significant cotton producers. The Aral Sea, as we have already noted, was largely sacrificed to irrigate it. The environmental legacy of that decision is still being lived with. Cotton is not a romantic part of Uzbekistan's story, but it is an honest one. A reminder that the land which produced so much beauty was also in the modern era, subjected to an agricultural logic that treated it primarily as a resource to be extracted.
Chapter 10. Uzbekistan Today. We have traveled a long way together through this land, from the first stone tools pressed into the earth at Kul-Belek, through the mud-brick towns of the Bronze Age, through the satrapies and the conquerors and the scholars and the merchants, through all the long, layered, black city. Complicated story of a place that has been continuously inhabited and continuously remarkable for longer than most of the world's great civilizations have existed. And now, at last, we arrive at the present. This is Uzbekistan as it is right now, in this decade, in this moment. The country is, above all, young. Not in historical terms. We have established, quite thoroughly, that it is one of the oldest inhabited places on Earth, but demographically, with a population that now exceeds 37 million people, Uzbekistan is the most populous country in Central Asia, and its median age sits at around 28 years old. More than half the population has been born since independence. We see the rates of government, the world as a main. They have grown up in a country, not a Soviet republic. That distinction, which might seem abstract to an outsider, shapes everything: the culture, the politics, the economic ambitions, the sense of what is possible and what is owed. Tashkent, the capital, holds more than 2.5 million of those people within its boundaries, a modern, sprawling city that carries its history in layers, the way all great cities do. Soviet-era apartment blocks line wide boulevards designed for the ceremonial traffic of a different era. Ancient bazaars occupy the same neighborhoods they have occupied for centuries, their noise and color unchanged in rhythm, if not in specific goods. And rising alongside and between all of this, the glass and steel of new construction hotels, offices, the commercial architecture of a city that wants to be taken seriously on the world stage. Tashkent is not a museum. I have a high basket and I tell myself, I've had my brains black, knee in Kriya. It is a living city, complicated and occasionally contradictory, with all the energy that a very young population brings to a place that is trying to figure out what it wants to become. The faith that has shaped daily life here for over 1,000 years continues to do so. Around 88% of the population identifies as Muslim, predominantly Sunni, and the rhythm of that faith moves quietly through everyday life in the ways it always has: the call to prayer, the observance of Ramadan, the family gatherings that structure the social calendar. Alongside the Muslim majority, around 9% of the population is Orthodox Christian, a largely Russian-speaking community, a legacy of the Tsarist and Soviet periods of settlement. The two communities have generally coexisted with a particular pragmatic tolerance that seems to develop naturally in places where multiple traditions have been sharing the same ground for a very long time. In this case, the Chinese government have committed no new way, shooting and dance. This is why held Baker. Economically, the Uzbekistan of today is a country in motion. The GDP has surpassed $145 billion, driven by an export sector that has been growing sharply, up more than 20% in recent years, and supported by gold reserves that exceed $60 billion, one of the largest sovereign gold holdings in the world relative to the country's size. Cotton remains significant, as does natural gas, as do textiles and a growing automotive manufacturing sector. But the direction of ambition has shifted. Since the reform program that began under President Mirziyoyev in 2017, there has been a deliberate push toward diversification, toward digital economy development, toward the application of artificial intelligence in agriculture and healthcare, toward data infrastructure, and, perhaps most ambitiously, a national satellite program. These are the aspirations of a country that does not intend to remain defined by its Soviet-era economic inheritance. Foreign investment has responded. Over $43 billion in foreign investment has been attracted by the reform environment of recent years, a number that would have been almost unimaginable in the Karimov era. Now, every business is healthy. Visa-free access has been extended to more than 90 countries, and the effect on tourism has been dramatic. The ancient cities Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, which were already extraordinary, are now accessible in ways they simply were not a decade ago. Visitors who arrive expecting a remote and difficult destination often find something warmer and more welcoming than they anticipated. The hospitality culture of Uzbekistan, which is genuinely deep-rooted and genuine rather than performed for tourism, tends to surprise people who arrive with expectations formed by news coverage of the region. Politically, the picture is honest in its complexity. The political system remains authoritarian in its structures. There are no legal opposition parties in any meaningful sense. Civil society operates within constraints that limit what can be said and organized publicly. Mirziyoyev has pursued genuine economic and social liberalization while maintaining the centralized political control that his predecessor established. Whether the economic opening will eventually generate pressure for political opening is a question that political scientists watch carefully. It is not yet answered. It is not yet answered. The environmental legacy that we have returned to several times across this journey remains one of the most pressing realities of contemporary Uzbekistan. The Aral Sea, or rather, what remains of it, continues to haunt the northwest. I arrive from the fires. The salt and dust from the exposed seabed blow across the surrounding region, affecting health and agriculture for communities that had nothing to do with the decisions that caused the disaster. But there are now genuine restoration efforts underway. Saxol trees, the same desert trees that grow in the Kizilkum, are being planted across the former seabed to stabilize the dust and reduce the environmental harm. The southern Aral Sea has been partially restored in the Kazakhstani sector through engineering interventions. Progress is slow, and the sea, as it was, will never return. But the effort is real, and it represents something important, an acknowledgement that the damage must be addressed, not just accepted. Uzbekistan today is, in some ways, the sum of everything we have heard tonight. The geography that shaped it, the landlocked continental position, the great rivers, the desert heart, and the fertile valleys is unchanged. The demographic energy of a young and growing population is new. The ancient cities are being rediscovered by a world that is only now beginning to appreciate what is there. The economic reforms are creating possibilities that did not exist a generation ago. And beneath all of it, the long, deep continuity of a culture that has been absorbing and adapting and persisting for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, continues its patient, unhurried work. The country that exists today, proud of Timur, proud of Ulubek, proud of the Registan and the great madrasas and the Silk Road heritage, is also a country of 37 million people who wake up in the morning and go about their lives, managing the gap between history and the present, between the extraordinary past and the complicated now, in the way that all people in all places always have. Quietly, persistently, together, closing. And so, we rest here, at the end of a very long journey. We have moved through deep time tonight, through the silence of the Paleolithic, through the slow patience of the first farmers, through the rise of cities and the arrival of empires, and the long, layered accumulation of a civilization that refused, across every disruption and conquest and reinvention, to be extinguished. We have walked the streets of Samarkand in our minds, stood at the edge of the Kizilkum desert, traced the course of the Amu Darya as it moves through the flat, ancient land toward the ghost of a sea that used to be. We have heard the names of people who changed the world from this quiet center. Ibn Sina, Ulugh Bek, Timur, And we have also tried to hear the quieter names. The farmer tending the irrigation channel at dawn, the woman weaving at her loom, the child learning prayers in a language not quite their own. All of them, part of the same long story. There is something that happens when you spend time with a place like this, really spend time with it, tracing its shape across millennia, rather than just glancing at the surface. It begins to feel less remote, less other. The people who built the Registan were not so different from the people who built everything else that human hands have ever made, driven by the same mixture of devotion and ambition and the desire to be remembered, to leave something behind that would outlast them. The farmers of the Bronze Age oases worried about the same things that farmers have always worried about: water, weather, the reliability of the harvest. The merchants on the Silk Road wanted what merchants have always wanted: fair exchange, safe passage, a profit at the end of a long road. We are, across all of time and all of geography, more similar than the distances suggest. Uzbekistan is still there tonight, as it has always been. The Kalyan minaret is still standing in Bukhara, as it has stood for 9 centuries. The tilework of Shari Zinda is still catching whatever light remains after sunset, as it has caught the light for 800 years. The Fergana Valley is still green, the Kizilkum still vast, the stars over the desert still extraordinary in their clarity, the way they always are, far from the lights of cities, in a place where the sky has not yet been crowded out. Somewhere in Tashkent, a city of nearly 3 million people, someone is sharing a meal with their family right now. Clove in a dish at the center of the table, bread broken and passed around, tea poured into small cups, the ordinary warmth of people who love each other, gathered in a room together. That scene, that specific, unremarkable, precious scene, has been playing out in the oasis cities of Uzbekistan for 4,000 years. Different rooms, different people, the same gesture. Let that thought settle in you now, if you like. The continuity of it, the long, unbroken thread of human life in that place, holding through everything, through conquest and collapse, and renaissance and devastation and rebuilding, and still holding tonight. You have been still for a while now. Your breathing has slowed, perhaps, without you noticing. The day's weight has moved a little further away. That is what a long journey does. It creates a gentle distance between you and the immediate, and places you somewhere larger, somewhere older, somewhere that has seen enough of time to know that most things pass and most things continue, and that both of those things are, in their own way, a comfort. Rest now. The desert is quiet. The rivers are moving in the dark, as they have always moved. The ancient cities are sleeping under the same stars they have always slept under. And so can you.